Is ADHD a disability or a superpower?
It's both, depending on the context and the person.
Professor James Brown is an ADHD expert, neuroscientist, and author helping millions understand the condition from both science and lived experience. If you've ever wondered whether you or a loved one might have ADHD, this episode is for you.
So the main substance I used was cocaine, and I could not go to a wedding, family gathering, a staff Christmas function, like a staff leaving do, without taking cocaine. What we need in ADHD is the other type of release, which is kind of slow, gradual over the course of the day, which is called tonic release. We know that relationship success or relationship dissolution, divorce, breakups, is at least twice as high in partnerships where at least one partner has ADHD.
Is there anything practical they can be doing to better mitigate their negative symptoms?
There is.
Is ADHD a disability or a superpower?
It's both, depending on the context and the person. And this is one of the big, I think, controversies and issues we have within the community, because many people, particularly people who are successful, will say it's a superpower. Very recently, Annie Lennox, an incredible artist, announced they'd been diagnosed with ADHD and said it's a superpower, and Rory Bremner and lots of other people who've achieved incredible things have. And it's easy to see why it would feel like that. If something that you're really good at, a hobby, a talent, becomes your job and you become successful, and you don't then have to deal with a lot of the day-to-day admin and management of life that ADHD makes challenging, then it can feel like a superpower. For many people, if you're not lucky enough to have a job or a hobby or a career or an environment that supports your ADHD, then it feels like a disability. And that's where the real issue is, I think, because the message gets diluted. Because people who don't have ADHD will hear, well, it's a superpower, and might think, well, why do you need special help at work? Why do you need reasonable adjustments? It's a superpower. And equally, people who don't feel like it's a superpower can feel like, well, I'm even doing ADHD wrong. I haven't managed to unlock my superpowers, so I'm even getting this wrong. So for me, it isn't a superpower. For somebody who says it is, that's their lived experience, would never challenge it, but it's not for everybody. It's very contextual.
I mean, before we hit record, I was saying that I'm looking into ADHD myself, and the way I'm kind of experiencing it, if I am experiencing it, that is the last guest I had on was Dr. John Cruz, who is a neuroscientist expert on ADHD, and the way he puts it is ADHD isn't a lack of attention; it's an inability to focus attention. And so I noticed that in my own life, and I noticed the difference between an importance-driven brain and an interest-driven brain. And one example is happening in my life as we speak. I'm planning a relocation down south from Edinburgh at the moment, and that requires me to apply for jobs. And the jobs I feel like I need to apply for are jobs I'm interested in, and they happen to be extremely competitive jobs. And so I do see it sometimes on the faces of people who are asking, "Oh, have you found a job yet? Or are you heading down there?" Almost like, "Why are you not down there yet?" And it's I think it's that sort of difference between an importance-driven brain and an interest-driven brain. I know it's important that I get down there soon, but I know I can't get down there unless I'm interested in doing it, or unless I'm going to be interested when I'm there. Otherwise, it's going to be unbearable.
Yeah, but you've hit on something that's fundamentally important. That at the heart of a lot of the issues, challenges, strengths, hobbies, jobs that we have with ADHD, it comes to something called reward, which is when the process the brain goes through when we're exposed to a person, a substance, a situation, or even if something is achieved or achievable, then the brain will perceive that as being rewarding, and reward gives us motivation. So if you find something rewarding, you will have the motivation to do that thing again. This is the reason people become addicted to substances or behaviors. If the brain finds it rewarding, it gives you this powerful motivation to do it again. Now, if you don't find something rewarding, and you can kind of transfer interesting and rewarding, sometimes they're interchangeable, then it's really difficult. And for many people with ADHD, and particularly those that probably don't see it as a superpower, if your job isn't rewarding, then it's a struggle to even turn the laptop on and start answering emails or doing reports, because your brain is looking for where it can find immediate reward, not in the task that is important, because it will pay your salary, it will pay for your mortgage. Your brain is looking for something it finds rewarding, which might be doom scrolling on a phone, or smoking a cigarette, or going onto Instagram, because it's got a lack of that internal reward, that lack of kind of dopamine for shorthand, and therefore it's always searching for immediate dopamine hits. So interest, novelty, and reward are very much part of how our behavior is often directed.
I do think the conversation surrounding the disability or superpower thing, I do like, I don't know, from my experience, I just like to think of it as just a different way of thinking. And there is that kind of neurodiversity amongst basically everyone, and there's maybe not names for certain ways of thinking, but I just view these different ways of thinking, if you can leverage them to your advantage, then they become not a superpower, but they become a benefit to you.
Well, they can. I'm gonna tell a little story now. So I won't name the person, but when I got diagnosed and we set up a charity and podcast and bits and bobs, we have an online community with our charity. And somebody who joined that community got diagnosed with ADHD and subsequently autism. And at that time, they were in a job that they felt they were failing in, and they were very unfulfilled. They were in a relationship that was failing, and they were unhappy. After diagnosis, they met someone, moved house, in 10 weeks learned how to code, and then built an AI and sold it for £2 million. Now that tells you how important context is, because if that person had never left that job, got diagnosed and realized that their brain works in a certain way and there are certain things that they will be able to do incredibly well, they would still be an unhappy person in an unfulfilling job, in a relationship that didn't feel great. So context is so important for many of us, and that's the real issue. Is for many of us, if you don't have that workplace support, you can't unlock the strengths, the positives that can come with being neurodivergent.
So we've spoken about like kind of that people experience ADHD in different ways. Are there any common symptoms that, say, the vast majority of people with ADHD have that people can look out for?
Yeah, and interestingly, it's not the diagnostic ones. So diagnostically, ADHD has two sides to it: attention issues and hyperactivity slash impulsivity issues. The attention issues are largely about, it's not about having less attention, but allocating your attention to the task you intend to without being distracted, or switching your attention from one task to another without finding it difficult. And the hyperactivity and impulsivity, well, hyperactivity physically is fidgeting and moving, but in adults it's often internal, like being restless, not being able to engage in restful activities, feeling driven by a motor, and the impulsivity, interrupting people impulsively, doing something out of turn. And because the way in which diagnosis works, you don't have to have all of those symptoms. You only need to have 5 out of the 9 attention symptoms. Everyone's kind of a bit different. But what ADHD is at its core is an executive function disorder. Now, executive functions are the higher level thinking skills that humans have evolved to have, like planning, organizing, working memory, prioritizing, emotional regulation, and that's the stuff that's pretty universal. So there are some people who classically will have the typical, yes, I make careless mistakes or lack attention to detail. That's the first diagnostic criteria for inattention. And some people will be forgetful, but pretty much all of us will have issues with organization, prioritization, planning, and particularly emotional regulation. And that stuff just isn't in the diagnostic criteria. The stuff that you have to prove and evidence is, do you make careless mistakes? Are you often forgetful? Do you lack attention to detail? Do you struggle to sit down when sitting down is expected? And For some people, it's a mixture of a few of those, but the universal stuff is actually the stuff that doesn't get spoken about. You don't see on TikToks or Reels, you don't see people talking about organization and planning and prioritization, but that's the stuff that pretty much all of us will have some issues with.
I think it's also interesting the different conversations experts are having. You have some experts that place more of an emphasis on the objective, so those symptoms that are in the diagnostic criteria, and then you've got other people who are maybe putting more emphasis on the experiential, on the subjective. So I thought like John Cruz was maybe putting more emphasis on the objective, which makes sense. Being a psychiatrist, you're going to look at that, and someone like Gabor Mate, who I've been looking into as well, probably puts more emphasis on the subjective, on your upbringing, on stress, on triggers, on things like that. That's not to say either one's less or more important, but it's interesting when we were speaking about ADHD in hereditary terms. So you've got some people that are saying it's 100% hereditary, or it's 80% hereditary, and the rest is stress or triggers. And you've got people like Gabor Mate, who is talking about, like, it does say there's a hereditary component, but something has to trigger it. What's hereditary is perhaps the sensitivity to ADHD rather than ADHD itself. What do you think?
So, Gabor Mate is a difficult character to deal with. He wrote a very successful book, Scattered Minds, which wasn't unhelpful, and it did point out the fact that adverse childhood events, trauma, stuff like that, can be a triggering event. What we know from there's tens of thousands of scientific papers on ADHD, and what we know is that if you look at the causes of ADHD, it's about 80% genetic, and part of that is hereditary genetics. Part of it, could be chromosomal abnormalities, birth defects, syndromes like Klinefelter syndrome. But about 80% of the risk, statistically, of developing ADHD is in your genes, and the rest is environmental. So that means it's almost never purely genetic. Almost never. There's no ADHD gene, for example. Normally you need to have mutations in 10, 20, 30, 40 different genes, which on their own wouldn't do anything, but collectively, alongside an environmental trigger, cause the brain to develop slightly differently. That environmental trigger can happen at any point from 4 weeks after conception to 3 or 4 years after being born. And most of the evidence points to things like exposure to pollutants or toxins in the air, medication taken during pregnancy, low birth weight, preterm births, and things like adverse childhood events or trauma can be that environmental trigger. But it's very clearly genetic and hereditary. If you look at the statistics on the hereditary side of the genetics, if one person has ADHD, their first degree relatives are around 7 times more likely to also have ADHD than a random member of the general public. And for those of us in more anecdotal terms, once you're diagnosed and you know what ADHD is, you often just look around your family and go, yeah, dad was. And I'm pretty sure my brother and sister are, and yeah, their kids have got the symptoms too. And you can see it, and it is something that we know does run in a hereditary fashion, but it is a mixture of both. So it almost always has to have an environmental trigger. In very, very rare cases, it can be purely environmental. So I think you're as old as me, Gregor, but I'm old enough to remember the Romanian orphanages of the 1980s when Ceausescu was in charge, and they had these absolutely abhorrent systems where orphans would be left in cots on their own in rooms of 20 or 30 of them without any human contact. And that level of severe kind of deprivation itself can lead to ADHD, but that's a very rare case. It's almost always a mixture of genes and that environmental trigger.
I think it's also interesting because if I'm investigating myself and I look at, say, my dad who could have it, my brother, I would say 100% had it. But what's interesting is the difference between how we experience ADHD. we seem to have experienced it in completely different ways. And the reason I haven't considered it until now, just turned 30, is because I did pretty well in school. And then I went to university and did pretty well in university. And I had this almost immature idea of what ADHD was, that it's just the hyperactive young boys and who struggle in school, who are shouting out, who are being a nuisance, and I wasn't that, so I mustn't have ADHD. But and I think that's how I'm maybe viewing my brother's symptoms. His symptoms, like dyslexic, struggled in school, and like this had never even been an option at school that he might have ADHD, so then struggled a lot at school. And so it's just very interesting to see the difference between how people react to ADHD or experience ADHD, which is hence why I had never considered it until now.
It's the first thing I'm going to say. I'm going to really gently challenge your language. It's not immature to think that. When I first found out I probably had ADHD, which was about 5 years before I was diagnosed, and my friend and colleague, and he's on the podcast with me, Alex, phoned me up and said, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD and you're way more ADHD than I am. And we kind of laughed, and I did all the online tests, which all screamed, you've got ADHD. But I didn't do anything with that information until lockdown, when my mental health kind of hit the skids. And then I realized I needed help. But I was a university senior lecturer teaching neurophysiology, and I thought ADHD was a condition of naughty, disruptive boys, and they grew out of it. And I know of healthcare professionals who in the last even 3 to 4 years have said you can't have ADHD because you're a woman, you can't have ADHD because you've got a degree or a PhD, you can't have ADHD because you're successful. But it's not a barrier to success, and we do all present differently. So I, as a child, and again, wouldn't have been able to be diagnosed because the NHS only built a framework for diagnosing ADHD for children in the year 2000 and for adults in 2008. I presented more like a typical girl with ADHD, which means whilst I was hyperactive, I was quiet, I was anxious, I was nervous, I was daydreamy, I wasn't disruptive and behaviourally challenging. So even if back then the tests had been there, I wouldn't have been picked up, because the tests specifically look for those kind of hyperactive boys who are disruptive. So that's meant that many girls have grown up into women who are now looking for a late diagnosis or an adult diagnosis of ADHD, because the test itself tends to pick up one particular presentation of ADHD, and that's the white boys who are disruptive when they're young.
Do you think society and culture is making ADHD more prevalent, or making the experience of ADHD worse?
It's a really good question. So it's not making it more prevalent. We know ADHD has been around for the entirety of human existence. The first scientific publication was 1775. There's actually even a book written by a Greek physician in 350 BC called The Obtuse Man, which described perfectly the symptoms of ADHD. There is a theory that modern life has caused ADHD to be a problem and not an advantage, and it's called the hunter-gatherer theory. And the idea is that before we became agricultural and then industrial, if you were distractible, you might notice things like, the reeds rustling and there's a predator there, or if you were impulsive and you were foraging for food and there was a new red berry, and red means bad, and someone else said, well, I'm not going to eat that, you went, oh, I will, impulsively, and it didn't kill you, you found a new food source. And those things sound beneficial. But what we know is, from looking at modern day isolated tribes, is that the traits of ADHD, which exist throughout the whole of society, everyone's impulsive occasionally, everyone is inattentive or distractible occasionally, the traits can be advantageous. But having sufficient traits that happen often enough and severe enough isn't advantageous. And I think whilst there is some evidence that lots of screen time can have an impact on, there's a recent paper about this, can have an impact on attention, the issue we've really got is largely the society that we've developed has been built with the neurotypical person in mind. And that means, for example, the expectations of someone is to act and behave in a certain way. And that's why many people with ADHD mask and hide their symptoms and try and present themselves as someone else because we get negative feedback and there's stigma and we get comments, particularly women, and particularly around our emotional regulation. And part of the problem with that is that when you mask heavily for years and then as an adult maybe seek a diagnosis, even when you're answering those diagnostic questions, you can get them wrong. So for example, that first diagnostic question, do you make careless mistakes often or lack attention to detail? If you are a perfectionist, many people with ADHD are, because of fear of criticism, and you check every email 4 times before you send it, you might say, well, no, I don't make careless mistakes. But that's because you have to check every email 4 times to make sure. So we often don't even use the right context for answering those questions because we have tried so hard for years to look like the round peg that society has built round holes for, when we're just square pegs trying to hammer ourselves into round holes.
Yeah. And you mentioned social media there. I was going to say, is social media having a negative impact? I suppose, is there a positive impact of social media on people with ADHD? And what is the potential negatives? There's a lot of misinformation around there, so that's maybe the obvious one.
Yeah, there is. So we'll start with the positives. A paper was published this week, actually, which myself and Alex are writing I suppose, a letter of complaint about, which looked at the impact of social media on assessment seeking. And they found that the increase in ADHD being mentioned on social media was linked to the increase in assessments. Now, that's not necessarily a negative, because the reason so many people are seeking an assessment for ADHD now is they know it exists. And one of the main reasons people know it exists is it's been on social media. So there is a broad positive that for many people, that's the first kind of penny dropping moment of, oh, hang on a minute, that makes sense. Now, the downside to this is that you're right, there's a lot of misinformation. And there have been scientific studies looking particularly at TikTok, which have found that 80 to 95% of the most viewed TikToks on ADHD are misleading. And I'll give you a really good example. There's different presentations of ADHD, so you can be purely inattentive, you can be combined inattentive and hyperactive impulsive, or purely hyperactive impulsive. Now, what you'll often see with these reels, because they have to be short and kind of clickbaity, is something like, if you do these 5 things, you have ADHD. If one of those things is fidget and you are purely inattentive type ADHD, you'll look at that and go, oh, well, I don't fidget, so I don't have ADHD. So it's easy for people to get misdirected because the information they see on social media isn't fact-checked or evidence-based.
And we've spoken about the term neurodiversity. Do you think that's a useful term to describe these different disorders?
So technically, I wrote an article in the New Scientist for this. Technically, neurodiversity describes everybody. All of society is neurodiverse. People who have ADHD, people who are autistic, dyslexic, have dyspraxia or DCD as it's known, are neurodivergent. So if we were going to be, I suppose, nitpicky, then neurodivergent is the term for people whose brains have developed sufficiently far away from what would be considered typical to think and act and behave differently. But where it starts to get more complicated, Gregor, and this is one of the things that I always try and impress upon people, is the ADHD community is itself neurodiverse. We're not all the same. We don't all have the same behaviors and traits. So if you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. And it's a really hard thing to explain to people who don't have ADHD, because our model, if you like, of conditions and disorders and diseases is that, oh, it looks like that. If you have type 2 diabetes, you're an overweight male, who needs to exercise, etc. But it's more complex than that with ADHD. So everyone's neurodiverse. There's no such thing as neurotypical, really, because even in the non-neurodivergent community, the breadth of behaviors and thinking skills, etc., is so broad. Technically, we're all neurodiverse, and those of us that are neurodivergent are just slightly different in how our brain developed to the majority of the population.
And what's the What's the typical experience of ADHD for boys and for girls? Obviously, there's exceptions to the rule, but in general terms.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So the presentation of ADHD is often different. So boys are often more hyperactive, more oppositional, more behaviorally challenging. Girls are often less hyperactive, more anxious, more daydreamy, more distractible. But this is where social pressures and social norms really come into place, because there are different expectations of those born as male and those born as female. So the expectations on girls to act in a certain way is what causes a lot of girls to start masking early. And therefore, the experience that many girls with ADHD has is being missed, not being diagnosed. And obviously, many boys have that as well. But until recently, the diagnostic rates from boys to girls were 9 boys for every 1 girl. And that's largely because the tests are so bad at picking up ADHD in girls. We also know that the stigma around ADHD tends to fall on women and mothers more than it does men as well. And it's the same when we're a little bit younger, is that boys who are being hyperactive are seen in a less negative way than girls who are being hyperactive or acting in an ADHD way. So there are different challenges and different presentations. And you would think that the main issue with this is that society doesn't understand it. But the main issue is actually education and healthcare don't yet fully understand this. In the education system, in order for a child to get diagnosed, amongst the criteria, you have to have evidence that the symptoms are having a moderate impact in 2 domains of life. So as an adult, that could be work, relationships, finances, home management. In children, mistakenly, what almost always happens is the only 2 domains they look at are home and school. And they don't take into account sleep and socialization and self-care and other parts of life. And what you often see is that the report at home will be, yes, like ADHD is hell, kind of really difficult to get them to disengage with the device. They struggle to go to sleep, they're hyperactive, they're oppositional. But in school, where it's a structured environment, the school report will often say, no, they turn up, they're not disruptive, they attend and their performance is okay. So often that structured environment means that children don't get a diagnosis because educationalists and the educational psychologists are looking for that disruptive pattern of behavior and asking the wrong questions. And it's the same in healthcare, where we are with ADHD, in my opinion, and again, you'll be too young for this, Gregor, is back in the 90s, chronic fatigue syndrome was called yuppie flu. And in the right-wing press and on the news, on television, there was this wave of, all these young people now are claiming they've got a yuppie flu and they just don't want to work. It's not real. Now, 30 years later, it's now a well-established, accepted medical model. We know that chronic fatigue syndrome is real, it exists, it's impactful. We are with ADHD now where we were with chronic fatigue syndrome in the 90s, where you're seeing newspaper articles saying it's not real, I get asked in almost every interview that I do something around kind of either it not being real or, is it bad that people are self-diagnosing because they're having to wait 7 years? We've got such a lack of understanding and training, even within education and healthcare, let alone general society, that most people don't know what it is. Most people kind of don't really understand it. And that's why we need people like you talking about this, sharing experiences, getting people to talk about not just their experiences, but what the evidence of ADHD is, so more people start to understand and accept it.
So is ADHD real then?
What it is? Well, no. No. So this is a really interesting question. It is, but I don't think it's what we think it is. So the complexity of ADHD really comes into the fact that it almost never comes alone. So 80 to 85% of people with ADHD have at least one coexisting condition. Now, most commonly, that's another neurodivergence, such as dyslexia, autism, or dyspraxia, or developmental coordination disorder. Next, it would be a mental health issue, so an anxiety disorder, a mood disorder, a substance use disorder. So it's complex. It's very rarely just ADHD. And even within ADHD, there is a growing theory that the purely hyperactive inattentive type, who don't have any issues or sufficient issues with attention to be diagnosed inattentive, that might be a different neurodivergence. So whilst ADHD absolutely is real, we kind of need to move away from this model of having siloed neurodivergences. So there's ADHD, there's autism, there's dyslexia, and to look more broadly at, okay, here's a person that has the characteristics of a neurodivergence. Let's see if they have the other ones, because most of us are divergent in more than one way. I'm undiagnosed dyspraxic. I absolutely am. And even if you look at the diagnostic criteria for both, they overlap by about 66%. So it is real, but the name is terrible. And the way in which we classify it probably needs to change in the next kind of 5 to 10 years.
Hi guys, just a quick message before we get back to the episode. If you're enjoying this episode, you'll love the rest of the content on my channel. So please like and subscribe. It genuinely means a lot. I know everyone says that on their YouTube channel, but it genuinely does mean a lot. It genuinely supports the podcast and it makes me feel better. So you'd be doing a good thing. Please subscribe for more content like this. Now let's get back to the episode. It's interesting what you're saying about the different areas that ADHD can affect. And I find, in my experience anyway, my sort of, I don't know if I'd say compulsion, but obsession was to perfectly balance every area of my life. And it inevitably always fails. And what I've noticed is that some areas are great. Like I have the motivation and I have just the motivation to do this podcast and to post shorts every day and to edit and to email people all the time and get, at the moment, no external reward, and somehow I still have the motivation to do it, which is great. But then there's other areas where it's like the complete opposite. It's like really low and I can't quite get those areas up. Is that like a very common aspect of the ADHD experience?
It is, and it again comes back to reward and motivation. So most people don't really understand what motivation is. We know that it's a driving force to do something, but there are different types of motivation. So internal or intrinsic motivation is the ability for motivation to come from within. So let's say that you're at university and you're writing a piece of coursework. Without any, if it didn't have a deadline, if nobody was reminding you or pressuring you to write it, you would need to have internal motivation to engage with that coursework. External motivation is the deadline, is the reminder that comes through saying you've got 2 days to hand that piece of coursework in. What we know is that people with ADHD are often less likely to have internal motivation and in some cases be what we call amotivated, so to lack internal motivation. And that means we often rely on external motivation. And there's a theory of motivation called the temporal motivation theory, which shows that actually the closer we get to a deadline, motivation increases hyperbolically. So as we get to the day before, all of a sudden we have the motivation to do it. But that's the stuff that we're not finding rewarding. The stuff that you're talking about, they're putting the podcast out, they're doing the shorts. If you find that rewarding, it automatically comes with motivation, because reward leads to motivation. If your brain finds something rewarding, it wants to keep doing it. It wants to carry on doing it. Great example, 3 of the most dangerous words in ADHD are just one more. If you're watching Netflix and it's nearly bedtime and you think, oh, just one more, and you put another one on, and then what that leads to is what we call anticipatory reward. So we know that the reward we get isn't just through experiencing things, it's also through knowing we're going to experience something. And that's a really powerful driver of motivation. If I know that I'm going to do something I find rewarding, I'm going to stick to that task. So the stuff that we don't find rewarding, the stuff that you're struggling to balance with the stuff you're doing every day, if it's not rewarding, we often have to find a way of working around it to make it more rewarding. So that might be gamifying it. So I'll give you an example. When I was an academic, I used to get 150 emails a day and I would answer every one. And my motivation was fear. It didn't come from inside. It was fear that people would think I was bad at my job, that I was rude, that I was lazy. So that fear meant I had to answer every email. When I left academia and I now run my own business, I value the emails I get far more but I don't have the fear motivating me to answer them. So I really struggle to answer 10 emails a day. So to gamify it, I have to have a little tally where every time I answer an email, I add one, and then I answer another email, and I see if I can beat yesterday's number. And that's the only way that I can actually answer more than 10, by gamifying it. So for unrewarding tasks, we often have to find a way to make the task rewarding, or to add it to another rewarding task to find it easier to engage with. Because if you don't have motivation to engage with a task, it's really difficult to start that task.
And so your experience, and obviously divulge as much or as little as you want, what is your experience with pre-diagnosis? What led you to thinking about ADHD, and what's your experience post-diagnosis?
It's a really interesting question. Pre-diagnosis, I always felt, from probably when I was 8 or 9 years old, I just always felt different. I always felt like an outsider. I always felt like, even though I was part of a friendship group, and even though I kind of did okay but not great at school, and luckily went on later to kind of do a degree and a PhD, I just always felt like something was off, like the world didn't quite get me, like I was nothing. And I didn't know why. And what diagnosis gave me, and this is the biggest difference pre and post diagnosis, is I understand myself now. And I understand why I felt like an outsider, and I understand why relationships failed, and why, I left a job after a month because I didn't get praise for bringing a table into the pub, for example. And I know why these things happen. And for years, I'd carried all these internal labels of, you're flaky, you're unreliable, you're useless, you're thick, you're lazy. And some people often complain that ADHD is a label and labels are bad. Well, I tell you what, it's better than the labels I gave myself for 45 years. It's much better to say I've got ADHD than to say I'm unreliable, I'm flaky, I'm not a real person. So the biggest difference post-diagnosis is that I'm able to accept myself more, and to understand myself more, and to look at the past, when I do look at the past, with slightly kinder eyes. Because I always used to look at it and think, why did you do that? You idiot, you made that mistake, made that decision, that thing happened. And now I can look at it and say, well, it kind of makes sense that thing happened. And emotionally accepting ADHD is one of the most powerful things you can do, because it reduces that negative self-talk, the shame that many of us carry for our behaviors, which we don't need to carry.
It's like, there's a quote, annoyingly, it's Louis C.K., so problematic person aside, we'll separate the quote and the person, but he's speaking about trans people and saying, what a gift to figure out what's wrong with you. That you, like, one day you're like, oh, it's that's the thing. And it's that relief just comes, it's like, it's just not me, I'm not a big mess of things. It's just, this is the reason for everything that I've been feeling the past however many years.
Yeah, it's a powerful lens. Once that lens drops, and you can see the things that you've done in a different context, it does change how you view most of them. And some of us regret things. I tend not to. I'm very lucky in that respect. But what that also does is it gives you the opportunity to look at the now and the future a little bit. That lens, understanding yourself, means that when things are happening now, it can help. And one of the ways that I love describing ADHD, which I may have to go into not only a tiny bit of detail, is it's effectively, ADHD is about performance, not ability. And it's largely consistent inconsistency. So with ADHD, we can do the things we struggle with, we just can't do them all the time. So, it's like Usain Bolt ran the 100 meters in, was it 9.52 seconds? But he didn't do that every time. So he had the ability to do that, but his performance wasn't always at that level. And it's like the same with ADHD, whether it's engaging with work, remembering things, sticking to routines. We do it some of the time, but then some of the time we don't. And what that means is that without understanding and accepting that, it can be really confusing to have a good day and then a bad day. And good days are the enemies of bad days, because then on a bad day you think, well, I could do that yesterday. I got up yesterday and I brushed my teeth and I showered and I did all the work and everything went well. And then this morning I've got up and I haven't eaten breakfast or brushed my teeth, and I'm wearing the same clothes as yesterday, and I've forgotten that I had a meeting at 9 o'clock. Why is this happening when it didn't happen yesterday? And there are so many different factors that impact ADHD. Sleep, for example, around 80% of people with ADHD have an issue with sleep. And we know that a lack of sleep makes every ADHD symptom worse. So accepting that it's going to be up and down for the rest of your life, it's going to be up and down. Good days, good weeks, bad weeks, days when you absolutely nail it and in 3 hours do a whole day's work, and days where in a whole day you don't do 5 minutes work. Knowing there's a reason for that and accepting that, again, helps with the guilt and the shame and the negative self-talk you have for those bad days where it's just more difficult to get stuff done.
I think one of the overarching issues I have that maybe encompasses maybe every little issue I have is rest. Like it's almost unbearable to kind of stop and do nothing. Even just watching TV, I find sometimes unbearable. And it's one of the kind of paradoxes of my experience. It's craving that rest all the time. Oh, I just want to go back to bed. I just want to watch TV. I just want to do these things. And then when I actually do it, oh, it's rubbish and I can't do it. I need to get back up. I need to do something. I need to tick a box. I need to do something.
It's painful. So we have a word for it, which it isn't a real diagnosis, but we call it domestic anxiety. And that is that feeling that at the end of the day or at the weekend or on a holiday, when you go, right, okay, sit down, and your brain just goes, nope, do something, but at the same time says, yeah, but I'm not going to let you do something. So you've got this internal kind of drive to get up and do something, but you're also exhausted, but you can't find what it is that you need to do. And that internal restlessness is how hyperactivity presents in most adults, rather than the fidgeting, although I am very externally hyperactive. That restlessness, that domestic anxiety, as we call it, is the reason. And I'm very open about this. I've been a substance user for most of my life. I'm lucky that I've managed to stop using most of the substances that I did. But this is one of the reasons many of us turn to substances, because it quietens down that kind of internal conflict of, oh, I've got to do something. And anything that kind of removes that conflict is very seductive. And it's why, many people, when it gets to 6 o'clock, will have a glass of wine or a joint or something, because that feeling of, right, okay, now I can just rest. But what's rest? Just sit and watch the telly. Even though I love it, my brain's screaming, no, do something else. Just anything that turns that off can be really seductive. So that, I recognize that feeling so much. When I first met my wife, who's ADHD and autistic, neither of us were diagnosed, so we didn't know. And our first holiday was a beach holiday. Now, my wife can sunbathe for 8 hours a day. And I can sunbathe. I timed this the last time it was sunny in Birmingham. I can sunbathe for 3 minutes and 47 seconds before I have to get up and do something. But that first holiday, and this is a great example of masking, that first holiday, I thought, she's going to think I'm weird if I can't just lie here. So I lay rigid, stiff as a board for 8 hours a day, internally screaming my brain, do something, get up, do something. You can't just lie here, because I thought I can't let her know that I can't lie down on a nice sunny beach. But that for me, like sunbathing, is torture. The idea of just lying in one position with nothing, even with a book or music to occupy me, that's not enough. And I can't do that. So absolutely, it's such a, for those of us that are hyperactive, impulsive or combined type, it's such a driving force behind how we behave, because that thought of just, I'll just sit around and relax for the weekend is terrifying for me.
You mentioned addictions as well. I think that's one way, if we're talking about modern society, modern culture, perhaps making things worse, the kind of new addictions that we have that are even more accessible than, say, hard drugs or alcohol. You don't have to go out the house to get them. You can just flip open the laptop. You've got pornography there. You can go into social media. You can scroll gambling and stuff like that. And I know this is a very simple question with a very complex answer, but in what ways did you get through substance addiction?
So the interesting thing is, I never use the word addict, and I kind of still don't, but I am. And I'll give you a very recent example of how I clearly still am. I recently watched the Charlie Sheen documentary, And my take-home message was, I really want to try crack, which is not a healthy, or that's not the take-home message from that documentary. That a man's kind of spiral from fame because of substance use. But all I took from it was, that looks amazing. So I know I still have this deep desire to engage with substances. For me, my substance use was almost always to calm my brain down. And it may sound odd. So the main substance I used was cocaine. And I could not go to a wedding, family gathering, a staff Christmas function, like a staff leaving do, without taking cocaine, because the just the internal noise of sitting at a table with 10 other people would paralyze me. I couldn't speak. But if I took cocaine, everything would go quiet and I could just listen to people and talk to people and appear to be normal. And I now realize I was self-medicating. And we know that most substances, particularly cocaine, cause a big release in dopamine. And dopamine is one of the brain chemicals involved in ADHD. So I was just using an illicit substance to medicate myself so that I could function in particularly social environments in which I just could not function without it, because I found it so difficult. Even if it was just me talking to one other person at a social event, I couldn't handle it unless I had that calmness of having taken a substance. And at the time, of course, I thought it was, well, it's partying. It's what middle class white people do when they've got money, is they take cocaine. Well, it wasn't. It was me desperately seeking for internal calm, which I'd never had in my life.
I think it's interesting that was one of the things I was surprised about, is that the medications to treat ADHD are stimulant like, or that ADHD people respond well to coffee. And if their brain's going 100 miles an hour, it seems almost counterintuitive that something that's supposed to perk you up is going to work. But going back to Gabor Mate, whatever like our opinions are of him, one of his ways of describing those medications and what they do is that there's a police officer directing traffic in your brain, and someone with ADHD, the police person kind of falls asleep, and a stimulant wakes them up, so to kind of direct the traffic again, to kind of focus your brain again.
It's not a bad analogy. So the biological issues with ADHD in the brain, you can kind of separate into two parts. One is the connectivity. So the brain works in networks. No one behavior is governed just by one part of the brain. So attention has 3 different networks, for example, that govern it. And therefore, those parts of the brain need to communicate with each other. And in ADHD, they're slightly poorly connected. The other biological issue is chemically based, neurotransmitters. Now, you'll often hear that we have less dopamine in ADHD, and that's not true. What happens in the ADHD brain is that dopamine and all neurotransmitters are there as chemical messages. So one neuron, if it wants to speak to another neuron, will release a neurotransmitter, in this case dopamine, across a tiny little gap called a synapse. That will bind to a receptor, and then the next neuron can pass that signal along. In ADHD, most of the mutations that we know are either in the receptors for that chemical, or for these little channels called transporters, which suck the neurotransmitter away as soon as it gets released, so it doesn't hang around long enough. And what ADHD medications do is to block those transporters, first of all. So it means that when dopamine's released, it stays around long enough to have an effect. And it also, one of the stimulants, lisdexamfetamine, causes an extra release of dopamine and noradrenaline and also serotonin. But it's about the amount. The dosages are so finely tuned of the stimulant medication, they're specifically designed to block 50% of those transporters. Any more and you get a high, because you'll have loads of dopamine. Any less and it's ineffective. And this is why they have mixed success with people. They work for some people, don't work for other people, because our brains are all different. When we take a substance such as cocaine, what we get is a huge release of dopamine, which is called phasic. It's like a burst of dopamine. What we need in ADHD is the other type of release, which is kind of slow, gradual over the course of the day, which is called tonic release. And that's what these low doses of stimulants do, is they cause this increase in the kind of stable, gradual release of dopamine, as opposed to the big spiky release of dopamine you would get by taking a stimulant. And what that causes is called paradoxical calming. So it's a stimulant, but it actually quietens things down in the brain.
And you've spoken about how ADHD affects relationships. So let's start, how does it affect romantic relationships to start with?
It's probably at diagnosis, the biggest issue people report. We know that relationship success or relationship dissolution, divorce, breakups, is at least twice as high in partnerships where at least one partner has ADHD. The way in which it manifests is very variable, but generally, on average, you tend to see issues with both emotional and physical intimacy. Emotional intimacy issues come from the fact that the non-ADHD partner often feels they're parenting the ADHD partner. They're having to do the admin, they're having to remember to pay the bills, they're having to pick the kids up. And that leads to resentment. It leads to a lack of the pillars of emotional intimacy: vulnerability, trust, empathy, and action. They tend to disintegrate. With physical intimacy, there are loads of issues, and I have no shame, so I'm happy to talk about this. Everything from sensory processing, which is often different in ADHD, and particularly if you also have autism, means that being touched in a certain place can either be like a big no-no or like really good, which means that you can either, for example, want to receive oral sex for 5 hours because it feels really good, or never want to receive oral sex because it feels a bit odd. And because, let's face it, couples don't talk about these things. We don't at the start of a relationship give our partner a sexual manual saying, these are the things I like and these are the things I don't like, these are the things I'm good at and these are the things I need practice at. We don't do that. We use past experiences. So for many relationships, the sensory side of things can be too much. Then you've got distractibility. And I've told this anecdote so many times. It's really difficult to maintain an erection when you're thinking about crisps. And that's happened to me, Gregor. Prawn cocktail, if that offers any mitigation. But because something called spontaneous mind wandering happens more often in ADHD, and that's when you're involved in a task and all of a sudden your mind starts thinking about other things and then you're back in the room. If you're trying to stay in the moment, maintaining arousal when your brain is thinking about crisps, or it's noticed the cobwebs in the corner of the room, or it's thinking about something else, is really difficult. And then if you add to that one of the biggest, again, non-diagnostic aspects of ADHD, rejection sensitivity, this severe emotional pain from being rejected or criticized or ignored. If you have a negative sexual experience, or even you think the other person you're with maybe didn't have a positive sexual experience, that can be a massive barrier to re-engaging with having sex, because you feel like, oh God, I wasn't very good, or they didn't orgasm, and oh, that's terrible. And then that rejection sensitivity means you can avoid that situation again because you don't want to feel that way again. If you add to that, we're more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, and that includes flirting, limerence, but also cheating on partners. And the slightly more serious and darker side, we are more likely to be both the victims and perpetrators of intimate partner violence for a number of different reasons. Means that there are relationships which are difficult anyway, can be a minefield. It's clearly not impossible. It comes down to communication. If you've got a solid and safe communication framework where you can talk openly without judgment about stuff, you can solve issues. If you don't have that, these issues just build up into unspoken problems which get bigger and bigger, and that then often leads to couples separating for things that really could be sorted out with a quick, difficult but quick conversation.
Is that the case for, say, all relationships? So like fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, anyone with ADHD, is that the best way of helping someone with ADHD or communicating with them? Is it just a better case of communication?
I think communication is important in the workplace. It's important in friendships. It's important in familial relationships, particularly in intimate relationships. And it is, again, if you think about those pillars of emotional intimacy, vulnerability, you have to be able to show your vulnerability and to not have it thrown back in your face. Because if you show that vulnerability and get something negative, then immediately you're going to distance yourself from that person. The trust that's built from that, trust that you know that somebody's not going to criticize you for your ADHD traits, empathy that people understand, you know, the lived experience of ADHD, and then action, people, including somebody with ADHD, acting to do whatever they need to do to keep that friendship or that familial relationship intact. The challenge is often that not everybody accepts, as we've said, ADHD is real. Particularly within families, you'll often get parents, because of the stigma that's associated with ADHD or the fact that, you know, it wasn't a thing in their day. Parents will often say, well, you didn't get it from me, or, you know, I don't know where all this ADHD's come from. And things like that can be challenging, but it often does come down to communication and understanding. And one of the things that makes this more challenging is many people with ADHD have this thing which we kind of call object invisibility, and that includes people. And that is, if something isn't in your kind of eye line, if it's something that's not visible all the time, you forget it exists. So I have friends I haven't sent a message to in 2 years. I love them dearly, but my brain just forgets they exist. And it's only when someone mentions a name and I'll go, oh God, oh yeah, I need to message that person. But to that person, it looks like I've just stopped communicating with them for 2 years. And you can understand how they might think, well, fuck James, I'm not going to message him if he's not messaged me. And so that's why good communication and saying, listen, I will go long periods without messaging you. It's not because I don't love you. It's just because my brain forgets you exist. And, you know, I cannot scroll down past the first window of WhatsApp because my brain doesn't find that rewarding. So unless it's at the top, that message is going to sit there for years.
And so I'm sure someone will be listening or watching who's maybe in a similar position to me, who hasn't got the official diagnosis and may have to wait years for an official diagnosis. What advice do you have for them? Is there anything practical they can be doing to better mitigate their negative symptoms?
There is, and they're not going to like this, and you're probably not either, Gregor. So what we know from the evidence base is the most powerful things that can help with ADHD are not the stuff that you see being marketed on Instagram or TikTok. It's not supplements which claim they'll give you more dopamine. It's not dopamine patches. It's not magic apps. The things that we know can help, first of all, are exercise. There is a really strong evidence base that regular exercise improves focus and attention and improves emotional dysregulation. We know that mindfulness not only improves symptoms, it actually kind of rewires the brain slightly. So engaging in mindful activities, whether it's meditation or yoga or using apps or breathing exercises, we know that improves ADHD symptoms. The biggie and the tough nut to break is sleep. Because for so many of us, sleep is an issue. We know that if you can improve your sleep just by 1 hour a night, that can have massive impacts. And that really means honestly looking at your sleep hygiene, because when people say, yeah, no, I don't look at blue screens, etc. And yeah, I don't do, you know, stuff that's too arousing before I go to bed. Most of us do. So your bedroom should be the coldest room in the house, 2 degrees cooler than other rooms. It should be very dark. It should be used for 2 things, and one of them is sleeping. You know, you shouldn't engage in exercise, alcohol, or a big meal in a few hours before going to bed. So following good sleep hygiene, and a tip that often helps is the 20-minute rule. And that is, if you get into bed, if you haven't fallen asleep within 20 minutes, get out and do something restful. Because if you lie there trying to sleep, you start to associate your bed as a place you don't sleep, and that causes sleep anxiety. It's the same in the morning. If you wake up at 5 and can't get back to sleep within 20 minutes, unless you just want to lie there and you're comfortable, get out of bed. And what that means is it may be a shorter amount of time in bed, but it reduces that sleep anxiety. So exercise, mindfulness, sleep, and the last thing is education, is learning about ADHD. The more you understand about ADHD, the more you're able to accept it, and the more you're able to accept it, the less impact it has on other areas of your life, like self-esteem and relationships.
Well, that's probably a good place to bring this into land. Where can people buy the book? Where can people stay up to date with what you're doing? Where can they listen to the podcast? Everything like that.
Oh God, yeah. So the book is called ADHD Unpacked. It's available. I want to joke and say in every good pound shop, but it's available in any in any bookseller that you can find. I like to think it's an accessible kind of guide to the science of ADHD. I've got another book coming out next year called Focus, the ADHD Productivity Guide. The podcast is the ADHD Adults Podcast, and we also have a charity called ADHD Adult UK, which has lots of resources on the website and an online community of about 9,000 people.
So I'll link all that in the show notes below. And when that book comes out, let's have another conversation, talk about that.
Absolutely.
Could easily do another 3 hours of topics on this. So
absolutely, mate.
James, thank you so much for taking the time. It's very, very much appreciated.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.